This podcast is part of the Big Heads Media Podcast Network. Go to bigheadsmedia.com for more great podcasts.
Welcome to a Forest Ramble Extra podcast. We're taking advantage of the fact that the home match against Reading has been rained off, and I've been joined by Baz. And Baz, you've got a little bit of a theory that's been on your mind for a while, and we're just going to have a little riff on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, basically, Forest over the last few years have developed this reputation for being a managerial merry-go-round, and of course, famously, Sabri Lamouchi, he hasn't brought his family over from France. He's only here on a one-year contract. He's only renting a place in the city centre, so that's basically he's expecting to be booted out at any moment, which, given the history of the club, is quite a sensible thing to be doing. But I wanted to look at it the other way around. So a lot of us are wringing our hands about this. We're all going, well, managers don't get enough time nowadays. In fact, O'Neill kept on saying it, 14 games in, I still haven't figured out what I'm doing, basically. Mm-hmm. So managers don't get enough time nowadays. Well, what about if you look at it the other way around? It's actually every single club has a managerial merry-go-round. Whatever the average time that a manager is at a club in the Championship's, 14 months now, 12 months, something like that. It's going down. So basically, it's the norm. So why wring our hands and look to the past and expect things to be the way they used to be? Why not just deal with this is the reality of it? This is how clubs are run nowadays. What does a club need to look like to be successful in that kind of era?
I can give you two counter-arguments to that. Liverpool and Manchester City, by far the most successful English clubs at the moment, and both of whom have taken on a manager, decided to buy into his philosophy and give him a bit of time. So at the end of Pep Guardiola's first season, everyone's going, well, it's not gone very well, has it? He's only finished, second or third? But you see the stark contrast between Pep's first season at City and then everything that's followed since. He needed a season to really implement not only his style of play, get the right players in and the right players out, and also to think about the structure around him.
Well, exactly. And the interesting thing with both of those, and again, you can contrast that with Manchester United, is what happens when Pep leaves, what happens when Klopp leaves. Has the things that they've done actually changed the club in any way? Is it going to give the club stability for the future? Or are they just going to collapse in a heap like Manchester United seem to be doing at the moment because there was no continuity?
OK, so let's bring this back to Forest. We were just having a look at the details on the website of who the club hierarchy are. Now, we all know that the club is owned by Evangelos Marinakis as the majority shareholder. Okay, we know that Nick Randall is the chairman, and we know that high-profile appointments recently of Francois Modesto and Jose Inigo. Jose. Anyway, we also know that there's other people who've been in place for a while. So, although we don't know anything about these people really, there's Yanis Rantsos, who's the chief executive. There's David Cook, who's the chief commercial officer, and Sam Gordon as the chief financial officer. And they're all Marinakis appointments, although Sam Gordon technically came to the club when Fawaz was still the chairman. Now, we've seen a little bit of David Cook, just because he sometimes takes pictures with the new commercial partners, and we saw an article about Sam Gordon in the Evening Post recently. Now, you look further down, you look at the sort of the coaching, not just the coaching staff, but the backroom staff as well. And we're looking at the head of performance. We're looking at the physios and the therapists and the nutritionists. You see lots of Greek people there as well. So names that you probably haven't even heard of. And to be honest, we hadn't until today. Alexandros Koinis, Thomas Papadas, Dimitris Kaplanis and Panos Makakis, alongside a number of British and, of course, French staff that Lamouchi has brought with him. So does this give you some confidence that when Lamouchi is inevitably not the Forest head coach anymore, which, whether that happens this season, next season or further in the future, that there's going to be some continuity?
Well, it is something that I've said to a number of people. One of the impressions I get is that Marinakis and Randall have a good idea of how they want a club to be run, and they're putting structures in place. There seems to be as well as the short-term project on the pitch, there seems to be a long-term project going alongside it, and that gives me quite a bit of confidence. But it's the short-term part on the pitch that's going to fund the long-term project anyway. So that part needs to be done right as well.
The other thing is we've heard plenty about how Marinakis is a very ruthless individual, and we've seen well, heaven knows, we've seen enough evidence of it even in 2 or 3 years at Forest, never mind looking across at his ownership of Olympiacos. So Martin O'Neill, he gave him an 18-month contract. It wasn't working. He was gone within 6.
Yep.
Karanka, obviously slightly different with Karanka, because Karanka, as far as we can tell, probably threw his toys out the pram a little bit. But
Although
Warburton,
there was some sort of backroom thing going on, I'm pretty sure of that.
well, that's as maybe. I mean, I guess we're speculating, aren't we? But certainly Warburton, since he's taken on the QPR job, he's finally had a chance to open up about how he felt really shabbily treated, in terms of he was kind of brought in as the coach and given a remit of, you do what you got to do. And then they said, well, you're not doing what we want you to do. And I have to say, while you look back and you think, well, Warburton wasn't necessarily going to get us where we wanted to be, you've got to have some sympathy when he wasn't given a clear sense of direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that's kind of what I want to get to about all this, because if you look at our managerial appointments, there hasn't been any consistency on that side of things. We can see that probably there's something building in the background, some sort of consistency, a structure to the club that Marinakis wants to put in place, and that's going to give us, hopefully, some sort of legacy going forwards. But that hasn't happened on the pitch, especially with the managerial appointments, and I think that has been costing us in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Just in the last 3 appointments, if you go from Karanka to O'Neill to Lamouchi, we've got 3 very different styles of play there. And because
and 3
of that,
very different styles of management as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And because of that, it's also demanded 3 very different styles of player coming in. And that's meant that's why we've got a big bloated squad. Mm-hmm. And although Lamouchi's doing his best to manage that, we mentioned it in the last podcast, that there might be some sort of that could have some long-term repercussions in terms of how the squad hangs together and so on. However, if there was some sort of consistency, if we had, and you could argue that maybe Warburton to Karanka was a bit of continuity in terms of their general style. If we had that consistency of style, then the recruitment could follow the same pattern, and therefore we wouldn't necessarily have to throw half the team out every time a new manager comes in.
Now, I appreciate the point you're making there. Now, obviously, the big restructure, I suppose, came with 2 transfer windows under Karanka. In particular, that first one where he'd been in job for all of about a week, and then he basically bought an entirely new squad in the space of 24 hours. Now, I don't think anyone's going to argue that that was a bad idea, because I think we can all agree, especially with the benefit of hindsight, that the squad we had then simply didn't have players who were good enough to compete even at mid-table championship level. So in that case, you could argue that Karanka had a bit of a, he's obviously given a bit of free rein. Look, this is what I need to do. And they said, right, if that's what you need to do, go on and do it. Now, that to me suggests that with Karanka, they did actually have some kind of investment in the way he wanted to do things.
Yeah.
And he was on a reasonable contract as well. So is it actually a case that Nick Randall and Yanis Rensos, as the people running the club on a day-to-day basis, they kind of feel a little bit burnt by the Karanka thing, and that's why O'Neill had a shorter contract, and that's why Sabri's only got 1 year?
Yes, I think that's quite possibly the case. And given that Marinakis has this reputation for ruthlessness, given that we are probably going to have this merry-go-round, we're probably going to have, if Lamouchi doesn't get us up this season, I wouldn't be surprised to see someone coming in. Mm-hmm. What I would like to see is that long-term project in the background starting to feed into the short-term project on the pitch. So, and I when we were talking about this earlier, I put the example of what Johan Cruyff did at Ajax, where the entire club was built to play the same way, from the youth team all the way up to the first team.
But obviously,
you could argue, actually, that Southgate's doing the same.
Yeah, you could argue that. And so, as we've discussed many times, especially when we're thinking about the shortcomings of Mark Warburton and how Karanka was better at dealing with those, is that, remember, formations and tactics aren't the same thing. So Southgate, he has used different formations. He's played 4-3-3, he played 3-5-2, he's played 3-4-3, and 4-4-2. But the actually underlying philosophy of what he's doing is remaining the same, and the tactics in terms of how he wants the players to play, in terms of what he wants them to do, in terms of the actual coaching he's giving them, not just in terms of what they do on the pitch, but how they conduct themselves generally, is really showing through. And you could argue, and I know some of you will be going, what's he talking about here? But you could argue that actually the way that the England team reacted to the racism issue in Bulgaria was a sign of a team who are united, not only in terms of personalities, but in terms of direction as well.
Yeah. And I think, and that's, again, to some extent, there are a team that has all grown up together through the England system. And that the whole England setup, the whole St George's Field thing, that's part of the same thing, is bringing everyone up together. And I'm wondering if we're doing the same thing, then that is some sort of way of mitigating the effects of the managerial merry-go-round, as it were. If we can do that, maybe that's what Modesto's been brought in to do.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is we've discussed this many times on the podcast, but we don't actually really know what a technical director or a director of football actually do.
Yeah.
Paul Taylor was saying on The Athletic that, as far as he understands, the role of director of football at Forest is different to many other clubs in the UK who've got a director of football, because Kyriakos Durekis, he has got this role which is very much more about looking after sort of rather than the footballing side and the coaching and the playing and that kind of thing. His role is actually more about running the club, I suppose, in a way. And obviously, we don't know what that means and how that affects, I don't know, what the chief executive or the chief financial officer do. But what we do know is that Modesto has obviously been brought in over the last year or so. He's been working with the club. He's moved over to the UK. He's now gone from being a scout to being a technical director. And it suggests that his influence isn't just because Sabri Lamouchi, as a fellow Frenchman, is the head coach. Does this leave Sabri Lamouchi with more or fewer reasons to worry?
Well, I mean, this is kind of it. So the implication is that behind the scenes, there is a philosophy behind the club on terms of how we want the players to play on the pitch. And if that filters through, then that's going to control the recruitment. If it's a style of play which is, I don't know, very expansive and wide, then we're going to go for wingers. If it's going to be something that's, I don't know, playing little triangles through the centre, then we're going to go for certain types of midfielder and all that kind of thing. So in terms of Lamouchi's position, when it comes to a transfer window, how much say is he going to have then? Exactly. If he's going to say, well, I need another striker, and he wants a big number 9, a replacement for Daryl Murphy, and the club says, well, that's not in our philosophy, that's not how we're going to do things, how's he going to react to that? And that's kind of that then comes back to the recruitment of the manager in the first place, and that's probably why Lamouchi is called the head coach and he's no longer a manager.
Yeah. Okay. I would also add in there that you mentioned about, buying a new striker or whatever. Obviously, at the time of recording, so today, Forest have just lost 2 games in a row. They were due to play Reading today, who are under new management themselves, and they're hoping to avoid that. And everyone is very acutely aware of the fact that Lewis Graben is the only senior striker in the club. Sure, we've got Rafa Mir, and incidentally, I feel that Rafa Mir is getting a horrendous overreaction.
He's a young lad.
He's a young lad who also has played literally a handful of minutes in the first team. If it was anyone's mistake to put Rafa Mir in the team against Wigan, it wasn't his. It was Lamouchi taking a gamble and it didn't play off. But at the same time, he also thought, well, Lewis can't play 3 matches in a week if we want him to be fit all season. Anyway, so when we're thinking about the recruitment thing there, so we signed Rafa Mir. We've got a backup to Lewis Graben in Rafa Mir, but we also let Ansarifard, Sudani and Tyler Walker all go, and then Lamouchi decided he didn't want Murphy, and eventually he moved on as well. Is that the coach's fault? Is it the club's fault? Should the club have done more to make sure their replacements lined up before? Sure, Ansarifard and Sudani, from an FFP point of view, really good business. But should the club have made sure there were replacements in before they let those out?
Well, exactly. And this is kind of what maybe we're in a transition period. Maybe I'm reading things entirely wrong with what's going on behind the scenes. And maybe it is Lamouchi's decision on how things are going. But I would say that if we are in a transition period, then it's almost like the strikers have fallen through the cracks. And it's like we've moved from a situation where it was the manager's responsibility to a situation where it's the director of football or technical director, one of those, responsibility, and the striking has just fallen through the cracks, and neither side has taken responsibility for it yet because the new system's not in place. Now, of course, I might be reading that entirely wrong, and maybe we just screwed it up.
Yeah, I mean, it is possible, and I guess even when you've got a good structure in place, things can still go wrong, can't they? I mean, the other thing it's worth remembering is that we've talked about how Marinakis is very, very ruthless. I think it's really worth remembering the way that company chairs do operate, and for any of us who've had any kind of employment in a big organisation, actually sometimes even in a small organisation, you know what? The chair, or even sometimes the chief executive of the company, they're not bothered about the details. They're saying, your job is to do this, your job is to do that, your job is to do that. You go off and do it, and if you don't, then I'll get someone else to do it.
The counterpoint to that, though, is you will also see in a lot of almost every organisation, the personality of the chair, of the CEO or whatever, also runs all the way through the organisation.
Yep.
So they might not be hands-on, they might not be detail-orientated, but their will, their style of doing things does carry through. So maybe it was just that, he was being ruthless, the rest of the club was being ruthless, too many strikers, get rid of them.
Well, also, I suspect, now, obviously, we're not football people, we're just fans. I suspect that there's an element whereby, you know what, an offer came in for a player who wasn't going to play every match in Ansarafard. Same thing for Sudani, a player who barely played last season due to injury but probably wouldn't have played every match anyway. So you go, hey, you know what, let's jump on that because we've got to think about the bottom line.
Hello to our listeners in the United States, and thanks for listening to the Forest Ramble. If you are one of the many sports fans who like to place a bet, then check out this offer from MyBookie. This is the premier place to bet on your favourite sports every weekend, whether you are into the NFL, Premier League or European football, hockey or Major League, or any other sports. The best part is, if you join right now, MyBookie will double your first deposit. So if you put in $1,000, they will give you $1,000. That's double your initial deposit that you can use on all your favourite picks. Use the promo code LATEFEES to activate the offer. That's LATEFEES for our US listeners to double your stake. Visit mybookie.ag today to take advantage of this offer and to view the all-important terms and conditions. You play, you win, you get paid.
Going back to what you're saying about structures and possibilities of chopping and changing, we've seen for example, in Serie A and in Germany, obviously Dortmund, everyone says, the next coach coming to the Premier League is going to be an ex-Dortmund B coach or whatever. And of course, the highest profile examples are Klopp, and then we had Wagner, who was at Huddersfield. We've got Thomas Farker at Norwich, Daniel Farker at Norwich, and so on. So is that actually maybe what you think the Forest hierarchy are aiming for?
I think there's an element of that, definitely. I think there's the way things are going, it looks like the general trend is managers stay in their job for fewer and fewer months, and so therefore the behind the scenes stuff has to be geared around that, for dealing with that, because otherwise they're going to have that upheaval every 12 months, every 14 months, and so that the club needs to be structured to deal with that sort of thing. And in some ways, I mean, the European teams have always had a head coach and a director of football structure in a way that we've not really had. Mm-hmm. So maybe they are ahead of us in that way. And
is this a symptom of the business of football, I suppose, whereby football clubs, naturally Forest are one of the most famous examples, as are Liverpool, as were Man United to a certain extent, of football clubs where actually the manager is literally managing the club. He is managing not just the team, he's managing the club. So he's the one choosing which colours to paint the dressing rooms. He's the one who's actually getting his paintbrush out to do it.
Or storing the club cash in a bucket.
Yeah, football is a very different game now, and clubs are run as businesses. And if we use that parallel of the way that actual businesses are run, if I leave my job, then the job still stays the same, and the people that you're working with still stay the same, and the clients or customers that you're working with still stay the same, but you want to get someone else in to fill the gap. Now, They might do certain things differently. They might be somebody who's a bit more proactive in terms of, making phone calls or sending emails, or they might be someone who's more focused upon resources or having a data-driven approach. But the job is still the same.
Yeah, and they will have a job description saying these are the things that you're responsible for, and they will have a personality description saying this is the sort of person who would fit well in the role. And it comes down, the fundamental question it comes down to is what actually is the football club about? Because it used to be the club was represented by the manager in many ways, the philosophy of the club and what it stood for. And everybody thinks of Forest, they think of Brian Clough, and they think of that particular way of playing, keeping the ball on the deck, hitting in the counter-attack, all that sort of stuff, to some extent. And the same would go for Liverpool, the Shankly and the playing little triangles and all that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. But in this day and age, where the manager changes very often, where the owners change very often, what is the constant behind the club? What is the thing that when you sign a player and you go, oh, that's not really a Forest player or whatever? Where does that come from? Where does that continuity come from? The only thing we've got at the moment is the fans. Mm-hmm. Are the only thing that holds that thing together, and ultimately a lot of the fans are basically, I don't care as long as we're winning. Others are like, well, no, we have to play the Forest mm-hmm. way, or we have to play the Man United way, or whatever it might be.
And do you think that sort of discord that you're talking about there, obviously there's a generational factor. So if we think back to 15 years ago when Gary Megson was in charge, there's a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth about players like Gareth Taylor being the mainstay of the team, because, well, what would Brian Clough be making of that? You know, a great big lump who's got basically no skill, is all elbows. Actually, in some ways, now I'm saying it like that, Brian Clough probably would approve, wouldn't he? And of course, even then, going back to that, Brian Clough had two eras, didn't he? He had the big thugs who won the European Cup twice, and then he had nice young men with lovely smiles. Yeah. So maybe it's not as cut and dried as that. But, you know, you mentioned about Liverpool and the Shankly thing. Now, if things are going the way that we anticipate that they will go this season and for a couple of years yet, actually Klopp's going to be so it's going to go Shankly, Dalglish, and then probably Klopp. In terms of Klopp has come in, he's got this style, he's got this personality, but also his teams do the gegenpressing thing. Okay. At the moment, with, again, going back to Man City, it's Pep and his really technical style of play, but where it's really, really, they just have the ability to just turn it on and completely overrun teams with their running and their movement, and most of all, the things that they can do with the ball as technical players. Now, I think that, actually, in that sense, Man City, they're going to have more of a problem when Pep goes than Liverpool will when Klopp goes.
Yeah, I can see that, because to some extent, the style that Man City play is Pep's style, whereas the style that Liverpool play is more just the German style. Yeah, if that makes sense. And actually, Liverpool's another example of that, because they had the whole Liverpool boot room thing where they always promoted from within to keep that philosophy going, Shankly's philosophy going, and then they broke with that quite, and that sort of coincided with them falling away quite a long way.
And I mean, them breaking with that, was that down to the law of Premier League riches? It's like, we must be chasing the dream.
I think to some extent it was. I think also maybe, and this is throwing a real spanner in the works, so to some extent that style had run its course. So there has to be changes at some point. Yeah. But they did that in the club of putting a philosophy behind everything they did, and then had that continuity through there.
But I guess what I'm getting at is, you can see that when Klopp eventually does move on, and there's no indication it'll be at any time soon, but when he does eventually move on, will it then be a Daniel Farke who is a Borussia Dortmund B coach?
Absolutely, yeah. And I suspect it will be. And it might not be Daniel Farke, obviously. It might be someone from within. They might go back to the Liverpool boot room style. Klopp might already be grooming his replacements.
Okay, but what about City? Because you look at Barcelona and Bayern Munich, it's been, although Barcelona is still a mega successful club, it's not Pep's Barcelona anymore,
absolutely,
is it?
Not at all. And in fact, the Pep style eventually comes from Johan Cruyff. So that's
true. Yeah.
But there's that continuity there. But he's taken it with him. He's not left a legacy when he's left the clubs.
Yeah. So what does that mean for Forest then? So let's assume then, regardless of going up, down, staying where we are, that Sabri Lamouchi at the end of this season is no longer the Forest coach. What does that mean in terms of who the next coach is likely to be?
Well, so it's going to be a very interesting appointment in terms of this discussion, because if the next coach that is brought in plays a similar style, and I think Lamouchi has quite a unique style compared to our previous managers. There are some similarities with what he's doing, with what Karanka's doing, with what Warburton's doing, but there's also a lot of differences in terms of the types of player. I was saying earlier about how Sambasau and Semedo are big misses for us at the moment, at the time of this recording, because they give us a certain level of movement in the centre of the park that is essential to Lamouchi's style of play.
But, as you also pointed out, didn't exist under Warburton, and Karanka didn't seem bothered about.
No.
So it's under Warburton, we don't know if he'll have wanted that, if maybe he didn't have the players to do it. But Karanka, obviously, he wasn't bothered about that. He liked his two solid midfielders, holding everything.
And he wanted the ball to move through passing, whereas Lamouchi wants the ball to move through running, which is a very, very different thing. And
which may also explain why, of course, Joe Lolly has, even though as has been famously discussed on social media this week, but Joe Lolly seems to have been a bit quieter, because actually Joe Lolly grabbing the ball and running at fullbacks stood out by a country mile last season when João Carvalho was doing it from the left-hand side or down the middle. It stood out by a country mile, and actually that is no longer the focus of the way in which we
carry the ball. Absolutely. And so the interesting thing is, if Lamouchi does go at the end of this season, for whatever reason, is the next coach that comes in, is he going to have the same style of play? Are they going to recruit specifically for that philosophy, or are they going to say, right, blank canvas, it's up to you, now tell us what sort of players you want to bring in?
So going back to the Forest squad issues as well, so as we've already discussed, Karanka was given carte blanche, like the players we've got aren't good enough, let's bring in players who are better suited, and he did that in 2 phases. And I think, in fairness to Karanka, I think it's fair to say he was very pragmatic about his recruitment in that first transfer window. I've got 48 hours and I need to get players in who can keep us in this division and make us more solid, because we weren't. And then the second one, he signed a whole lot of players who he hoped would take us towards the top end of the table, with varying degrees of success.
And I think the second phase was more reflective of his philosophy of football.
Now, obviously, Lamouchi has then had to spend a fair amount of energy clearing some of that up, and quite successfully, because really it's only Pantilimon and Jakob and Clough who are still there. Obviously, Steele may or may not come back in January.
I think, just as an aside, Jakob is the perfect example of the difference in the styles between the two, and that's why Jakob's not getting in the side.
What, because he's too static?
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got that idea about, Lamouchi has cleared out some players. He's put other ones to say, all right, we're keeping you separate from the squad. Do we think that massive turnover of players and the fact that Lamouchi's had a big job to do there, do we see that calming down in future transfer windows? And if what we say, if this theory is correct?
If the theory is correct, if this summer's transfers were done with Lamouchi's assistance but were aimed at building this philosophy, this style, then yes, in theory, next season when the new coach comes in, if that's what happens, then in theory we shouldn't need to have a massive clear out of players, because the same philosophy is going on. So your Saus, your Semedos, they're going to fit with the new coach's style of play just as well as they did, and you won't have a Jakob situation where you've got a player who's very good but doesn't fit.
What about, note of caution, Aro Muric was signed before Lamouchi became the gaffer. He played him because he's a high-profile player, and there's also like, Muric, he's going to be a great keeper. But at the same time, Modesto and or Anigo went out and they found 2 players called Samba, one of whom is, at the time of recording, the best goalkeeper we've seen at City Ground in about 10 years. And is that a sign that things are wrong, or is it just a sign that we've unearthed the diamond in Brice Samba?
Probably, I would say the latter, and they just made a mistake with Muric.
Okay.
Muric wasn't ready for what's happened.
Okay, let me put it another way. Let's look at what Samba is good at and what Muric hopefully will be good at for his own career development, whether it be at Forest, at City, or somewhere else entirely. Okay, so he's obviously been brought up in the Pep way. So yeah, he needs to make saves and needs to be commanding in the style of Edison. But interestingly, not in the style of Claudio Bravo. So even Pep gets it wrong. Okay, he also famously, Pep wants his keepers to be really good with their feet, and Muric has got the ability to do that. Maybe he isn't ready for it yet, and certainly not in the Championship where it's all sort of fast and furious. And that's where he's looked, and actually I think it's not doing the right things with his feet that's led to him looking flappy with his hands and with his head as well. Because it's a confidence thing. Yeah. But Brice Samba, he's really good at making saves. He's really commanding with coming for crosses, and he's also amazing. I mean, for all the disappointment of the whole match the other night, the only player who always found a teammate with his passes on Wednesday night was Brice Samba, whether it be a 5-yard pass or whether it be a 50-yard pass. Every single pass went to a teammate. So it's actually a sign that the philosophy in the keepers, there's a huge overlap there. It's just that they're different individuals.
Yeah, and it might be, one just not ready.
In a world where digital content barrels towards us at relentless breakneck speeds, where posts and memes and tweets and snaps rain down a punishing assault of attention-grabbing data, 3 heroic podcasters with a strong background in broadcast media are taking on the internet. Each week, we break down the trends, technology, and connections that are transforming our lives. We are Things I Found Online.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
All right, so it's been an interesting discussion. Of course, the other thing that you have admitted several times is that we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if this is actually the case. Would you like to see your theory proving to be the case in that whoever the head coach is, there's going to be more stability in terms of recruitment, in terms of style, in terms of coaching and structure?
Yes, and just in the way that, and you talked about businesses earlier, it's almost a brand thing. It's like, this is the Forest way. This is what Forest stand for. Before we had the Brian Clough way, which was also the Forest way. Now this is the Forest way. This is what you can expect when you come to see Forest, when you come to play against Forest.
And could that trip us up in any way? So, Daryl Murphy, one could argue, hindsight's a wonderful thing, he'd have been pretty helpful against Hull.
Yes, absolutely. And I think maybe it's, I don't know, personally I would have had Daryl Murphy stay, just simply, if nothing else, because we've only got one senior striker. But and it is that kind of what do you do when you're up against it sort of thing. He's a very good player for that situation. But it might be that why did he go? We don't know. What was the reason? Was it his asking to go? Yeah. Because he knew he wasn't going to get enough games.
Now, the other thing that's interesting, and this has literally just come to my mind, is that you look at how Villa got promoted last season. Sure, they needed to shore up at the back, so they brought in Courtney Hawes and Tyrone Mings. And of course, Mings has been an absolute revelation. And
my favourite player of the season, definitely.
Yeah. And interestingly, there's some bloke behind me at the match on Wednesday was going, well, I don't see, we were supposed to be in for him on loan, and why didn't we sign him? It's like, he cost £22 million. That's why. But so they shored up at the back, but actually the reason they got promoted was because in midfield they played Conor Hourihane, John McGinn and Jack Grealish, all players who are really good with the ball, really got the ability to drive but also to hold and know what to do at the right time. So a mix of composure and physicality. So actually maybe that Lamouchi formula is going to be a good formula for the Championship.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we can't do it when the players are injured.
Yeah, and especially those two, Sal and Semedo, they seem to be the big misses.
And as one thing I didn't mention in my match report the other night is that Ryan Yates coming back, I think, could be very important because he could be the player that bridges that gap. Yeah. Because he is a holding midfielder, but he isn't shy of grabbing the ball and just trying to drive. He may not have the best ability in the world, but he can do that thing, and sometimes that can make the difference between being caught in a defensive position to actually breaking forward, which is what Sal has been amazing at doing.
Yeah, and I think that's what what Lamouchi's kind of been looking for Silva to be doing, but that's not his game, really.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll leave it there for today. It's an interesting thought, and of course now that we've got an unexpected week off, it'll be interesting to see if that gives Sal and Semedo and Michael Dawson a chance to come back from injury, and I think that'll be the real acid test. As we've discussed in the past with the what makes a manager thing, actually factors outside of a manager's control can be problematic. For Stuart Pearce, it was losing 3 captains in the space of one match. For Dougie Freedman, it was losing his only goal scorer, meant that he had to go for a really kind of conservative style of play. So with Lamouchi, obviously, Sambasso, Alpha Semedo, Michael Dawson, going to be key players in his style of play.
Lewis Grabban.